When the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents advanced down Highway 142 in the state of Georgia, they could start to see in the distance the pyramids and sphinxes that rose among the landscape of plateaus and grasslands. It was the exact place where what could be a peaceful operation or a massacre with hundreds of victims would unfold. That May 8th of 2002 was the beginning of the end for Dwight York and the cult he had founded a decade ago. A cult that had led him to become a clear threat to the United States government. That same day, two simultaneous and equally dangerous operations would occur. First, they would capture the leader, whom they had been closely following for several months. If he surrendered without resistance, they would move on to the second phase of the plan, which consisted of dismantling the site where he had founded his sect with hundreds of followers. That's why, when the federal agents approached the property, where York was a sort of reincarnation of a goddess on Earth, they knew they could be playing with fire. Suddenly, they were notified by radio that the first mission had been successful and Dwight York had been apprehended. His followers needed to be equally cooperative. There was just one detail. They were armed with machine guns, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The case of Dwight York and the cult he formed around himself. It adds to the long list of cults that were gaining power in the United States in the last decades of the 20th century. How did he achieve it? Under a religious narrative that mixed messianism, extraterrestrial Islam, Egyptian polytheism, and racial claims that led to supremacism. But that was just the surface. Nuawianism, as York had named his cult, included child abuse that went on for years. Some of his followers, frightened by these practices, started distancing themselves from the congregation. However, it would be years before anyone dared to speak up, and that someone would be none other than his own son. How was this man able to openly abuse his power and commit crimes? How did he manage to convince thousands of people to follow him in his outlandish dream where he claimed to have a divine origin? What would have happened if York, instead of taking the path of religion, had developed his other facet, that of a singer? Despite the evidence against him, why do some still defend him today? What conspiracy theories emerged following his arrest? Trying to answer these questions will lead us to delve into the dark case of Dwight York and the Nuawianist sect. The life of the... It's hard to trace the biography of a man who systematically invented a story with touches of fiction almost from the beginning. Apparently, his date of birth was never entirely clear, even though the United States justice system managed to find out when he was born, on June 26, 1945 in Boston. Other sources place his origin on some day in 1935, and York himself claimed to have been born in Sudan, the African country that shares a border with Egypt. This would become very important in his adult life, whether it's true or not. In fact, York claims to be the son of a Sudanese aristocrat and an Egyptian woman. This feeds into the myth that he himself wove around his origin and destiny. But to get a sense of how elusive the biography of this enigmatic character is, it's worth noting that some media also picked up on various rumors. There are sources that place his birth in New Jersey, New York, Baltimore, or Ghana. Back in Africa again. York also mentioned in his long speeches that, after living his early years in Massachusetts, he moved with his family to Egypt, specifically to the city of Aswan. From the age of 7, he would have studied Islam with great interest in these lands, which would change his life forever, according to his words. Supposedly, one of York's grandfathers was a very high-ranking leader in the Muslim community of Sudan, and all of that was forming in him the clear idea that he should follow that path. It is assumed that at 12 years old, when he returned to the United States, he would have settled in New Jersey to continue learning about the religion of his ancestors. By the 60s, he was already part of religious groups heavily influenced by the Nation of Islam, a religious organization of great influence in the African American community, and that included figures of the stature of Malcolm X and the greatest boxer of all time, Muhammad Ali. In many of the marginal neighborhoods, the discourse of these religious congregations strongly captured the struggle for social claims and civil rights. But George felt that he still needed more training, and he traveled again to Africa in the 70s, where he finished shaping his project, his own religion. After returning to North America, he was resolute about creating something massive. He spent some time in Coney Island, then moved to Bushwick Ave in Brooklyn. That's where everything would truly begin. He became increasingly well known in the neighborhood streets. His charisma seemed almost hypnotically magnetic, especially among the young people in the suburbs, who felt there was no place for them in cities where white people had many more opportunities. But parallel to his growth as a mass leader, Dwight tried another way to reach people through music. He was part of various groups and had several solo albums, where he signed as Dr. York. His music was successful. He had his own label, first Passion Productions and then York Records. He even appeared in Billboard magazine. In the world of gospel, soul and hip-hop, he was a recognized and rising man. Even today, his songs can be heard on YouTube, and he even has followers who claim his artistic talents. Despite everything, the other, much darker framework that exploded in the early 2000s. Indeed, York's musical career faded at some point in the 80s, when his spiritual side began to completely dominate his life. By then, his goals were much larger than recording an album and much more dangerous. Dwight York's cult started, as they say, from the bottom. By 1972, the leader and his followers, who were already counted by the hundreds, settled in community housing in marginal areas of Brooklyn and over time founded their own schools. It was common to see York's followers walking the streets. They were easily distinguished as they wore long white robes, and they would stop to talk to children and young people in the neighborhood to give them books and pamphlets that discussed this alternative religion that was being forged. The curious ones came with quite similar stories of discrimination, violence, and disbelief in state and religious institutions, which seemed to speak only to whites. York was different. He told them they should be proud of their roots and break all ties with society as they knew it, also with their families, or anyone who did not share their beliefs. In this sect, they would have all necessities, including relatives. Some teenagers dropped out of school to fully devote themselves to listening to York's teachings. Every day more and more single mothers came to the Nuobianism with their small children, looking for someone to shelter and protect them. To his followers, George offered everything: housing, food, and the opportunity to learn Arabic until they could speak it fluently. In return, the control was total. George decided absolutely everything in the lives of his followers, especially the women. He chose how they should dress, speak, and who they would marry. Often it was with him. Polygamy was something totally usual and accepted in Nugaevianism, and over the course of a few years, Dwight George would have more than 100 children, both his own and those he adopted from his wives. These children had a different status than the rest. They had better clothes and toys than the other kids in the cult and were in constant contact with the leader. His wives also had preferential treatment, but quickly that concept became problematic. In an initial stage, George selected women from the age of 16 to give them sex classes, as he called them. He portrayed it as an initiatory rite, a divine gift, but we now know it was something entirely different. His speech was eloquent. George was convinced that a teenager would be faithful for life to the man who had taken his virginity. And under that idea, the abuses began, which became a regular practice in the cult. This became so normalized that, over time, the predator began to choose younger and younger victims. In 1993, Dwight York advanced his plan for domination. He sent his closest followers to establish small temples of worship to him in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Hartford, New York, and Washington. But York himself had an even greater mission. On January 15th, he purchased a nearly 200-hectare plot of land for around $1 million. There he wanted to found his own city, and later on, his own country. That's what the United States authorities automatically imagined when it was known that the leader and his followers had set up base in Georgia. However, they had no concrete evidence of what he was plotting, so they just started to watch him closely and wait. In the decade that followed, the Nubavivians went through many aesthetic transformations that reflected the mutation of their creed and their leader, and the increasingly incoherent and disjointed discourse he had. At one point, they could be seen dressed as authentic cowboys, but later they adopted an image closer to that of Native Americans. The city they founded in Georgia, which they initially called Kodesh, had other names such as Wahani, the Golden City, Altamaha, and finally, Tamare. Dwight York also went by different names such as Isa al-Hadi al-Mahdi, Malaki York, the Supreme Grand Master Dr. Malaki Zeta York, and Chief Thunderbird or Chief Black Eagle in his face of indigenous claim. Finally, when he fully delved into saucer beliefs and the unidentified flying object phenomenon, he was known as Yanuno. Of all these incarnations, the Egyptian one seems to have been the most impactful. Suddenly, in his city, York, he began to commission the construction of pyramids and sphinxes like those in Cairo. In turn, he adopted typical clothing of the ancient pharaohs, and things became more and more extravagant. Some of his followers questioned all these sudden changes, but none directly disputed York's leadership. Were they afraid of him? Additionally, the neighbors near that eccentric community felt uneasy. No one outside the cult could come in for a look. Anyone who dared to get a little closer saw Nubian guards equipped with assault weapons. No one could enter, but Dwight York assured everyone they were free to leave. In fact, his followers attest to this, and some began to leave when the children dared to speak. Ruby, one of York's closest followers and also one of his numerous wives. One day she saw a 5-year-old girl crying, distressed. When asked, the little girl said that York, who she called Daddy, had abused her. At some uncertain date, but several years before what was happening was discovered, Ruby left the city of Tamaray without anyone stopping her. She did not go to the police, and like many others before and after her, she kept Dwight secret for fear that the man would take revenge. Around 1998, despite not yet being aware of these abuse allegations, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began to investigate with a single goal: to discover if Dwight York was using his cult as a front to cover up crimes. And wasn't it too difficult to come across chilling details? When they began to investigate the origin of the millions of dollars that York had to sustain his sect and build his pharaonic city, they discovered various links to theft and gang criminal activity in every place where the Nubianism had passed. Alerted, the Federal Bureau of Investigation summoned Jacob York, one of Dwight's older sons, to testify. Surprisingly, the boy was cooperative and stated that he had not been in contact with his father for years. He had distanced himself from the cult due to the well-known abuses among the faithful. At that moment, Jacob told the agents that dozens, perhaps hundreds of women and children had been abused by his father, and that he himself had it in his car at that very moment. Outside the bureau, where they were interrogating one of their father's former victims, who was now his friend. Thus, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was able to put together the investigation it needed to take direct action and dismantle the cult. By the end of the 90s, a third of the women who had been part of the Nubianism had already abandoned it. And many were willing to tell what was happening inside if they were given assurances that Dwight York would not attack them again. The testimony of Ruby, the woman who had heard the girl, a victim of York in person and who had kept the secret for years. It was key to finally confirm that disturbing panorama of systematic abuses. He already had a federal case strong and solid enough to take action, without any legal loophole nullifying all that effort. Thus, on May 8th of 2002, federal agents took to the streets to put an end to that nightmare that for so long had flown under the authorities' radar. And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. Leader caught. When Dwight York left Tamari that afternoon and went to buy groceries, he knew from the start that the tinted window car following him was from the government. Completely calm and even smiling, York stopped in a supermarket parking lot and got out as if it was something completely normal. He identified himself to the agents, opened the door for the woman accompanying him and let them handcuff him. Meanwhile, a caravan of cars and special weapons and tactics agents were approaching the city of Tamare, with a constant fear that things could become complicated at any moment. The memories of the Waco massacre in 1993, the Ruby Ridge slaughter in 1992 and more were still fresh. Going back in time, the collective self-elimination of Jonestown in 1978. The United States government had to find a balance to demonstrate that the dismantling of a massive cult could be carried out without victims, and in this case, it achieved the goal. When the agents reached Tamare, the situation was completely peaceful, with no injuries or gunfire. And those who, until recently, blindly followed Dwight York agreed to be attended to and interviewed by the agents. Most of them, deep down, were relieved. A nightmare that seemed impossible to wake up from had ended. When George was tried in 2004, he had more than 100 reports of sexual abuse of minors. By then, a medical board had concluded that he was paranoid, had a generalized anxiety disorder, depression, personality disorder, and narcissistic and psychopathic traits. In other words, his messianic delusion was framed within a series of mental disorders. However, that did not make him unaccountable or unconscious of his actions. Dwork knew perfectly well that he was committing atrocious crimes and had built a cult around him that justified and concealed his actions. Over the years, in the face of overwhelming evidence supported by the testimony of hundreds of people who had lived alongside him, he was sentenced to 135 years in prison. In his defense, Dwork tried numerous arguments that seemed more absurd than the last. During the trial, Dwork formally requested to be judged by the tribe he claimed to belong to. In a letter to the judge, he claimed to be from a Native American community, as he had asserted when acquiring some of his various aliases. While he was a spiritual leader, he specifically demanded to be transferred to the Moore Cherokee Council Court, but the judge denied the request. Despite his conviction, he and his supporters maintained a directly conspiratorial theory. Some even claim that Dwight York as such never existed, and that he is not the same person who led the cult that so often changed its name and appearance. They even say that the architect of this great scam is Jacob York, the son of the accused, who was also the one who started the endless chain of complaints. This adventurous theory adds that Jacob worked hand in hand with American mosques linked to the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, which at times when its power was increasing saw New York as a threat. For those who still defend this hypothesis, international organizations linked to extreme Islamism were jealous of the level of influence that York had in the African-American Muslim community. They claim that place of strategic privilege. Although it may seem that all of this has little support, the truth is that York's influence in some way remains latent in a certain sector of the North American population. Even being imprisoned for more than 2 decades in the maximum security unit of Florence in Colorado, his words managed to break through the prison walls from time to time. In recent years, York has claimed to followers who still defend his name that the betrayal he allegedly suffered was predicted. In chapter 10 of The Wars of Gods and Men by Sikaria, Sitchin contemplated a similar plot, and York had that book as one of his bedside works. He saw himself as a character from the work named Marduk Chivo, unscrupulous criminal scapegoat. Were there really elites interested in silencing this individual? Another disturbing news that brought the George surname back to the newspapers. It had to do with one of his sons, known as Ramses. Richardson, who at 19 years old in 2017 was arrested for beating and setting fire to a 5-year-old child who was under his care. At the time of recording this video, in January of 2025, York is 79 years old, or perhaps 10 more. His songs, under the name Dr. York from that distant unfinished musical career, continue to be filled with positive comments from people who still disbelieve the pedophilia accusations and think that everything was a globally orchestrated lie. Justice says otherwise. But somehow the persuasive power of this leader seems to remain intact, for people who are waiting for the emergence, now or later, of another man to follow. Blindly.